There are prayers that conventional history simply does not record because they were whispered in silence inside poorly lit wooden houses by people who were afraid of being heard, even by their own neighbors. But researchers reconstructing everyday life on the 19th century Texas frontier found, in letters, personal diaries, and local church records, consistent evidence of a specific pattern of prayer that repeated itself with disturbing frequency during certain months of the year. Families praying, not for abundant harvest, not for health, not for prosperity, praying that the moon would remain hidden, for clouds to cover the sky during certain specific summer nights, so that the darkness, normally feared by anyone living isolated on the plains, became, paradoxically, the very salvation that would protect their families. This specific fear, documented through multiple independent sources preserved over decades of frontier conflict, had its own name among the settlers. They called it the Comanche Moon. And the question this investigation aims to explore goes beyond simply understanding why this specific lunar phase posed danger. It's about how this specific fear, so intense and so persistent that it has literally turned into everyday religious practice, reveals something deeply disturbing about the collective psychology of entire communities living under constant, unpredictable threat. And about what happened when science and religion, two systems that were supposed to offer answers and comfort, proved completely incapable of protecting these families against something as simple and as inevitable as the natural cycle of the moon itself. To fully understand why this specific prayer became so widespread among Texas frontier communities, it is necessary to first examine the exact nature of the astronomical phenomenon that colonists so deeply feared. The full moon, specifically during the summer months when temperatures remained high even at night, created lighting conditions that military researchers had already identified in previous investigations in this series as exceptionally favorable for nighttime cavalry operations. But what differentiated the specific fear of the colonists, documented through religious and personal sources, from the purely tactical and military analysis that military historians conduct retrospectively, was the deeply personal and deeply vulnerable dimension of this lived experience. These were not generals planning defenses. They were individual families, often isolated on farms far from any meaningful military protection, who had to decide on their own how to survive a threat they knew was statistically more likely during certain specific nights of the lunar calendar. Records preserved in Texas frontier Protestant church archives, according to researchers who have examined these lesser-known religious documents, repeatedly mention specific requests for communal prayer related to protection during periods of full moons in summer months, creating a documented pattern of religious practice that developed specifically in response to this particular threat. Some historians who study popular religiosity on the American frontier point out that this type of specific, targeted prayer represents a fascinating example of how communities under threat develop religious practices tailored precisely to the particular circumstances and specific dangers they face, rather than relying exclusively on more generic and more traditional forms of religious practice that they might have brought with them from their home communities before migrating to the frontier. There is a specific psychological dimension related to this fear that historical psychology researchers find particularly revealing about how communities process chronic, unpredictable threat over prolonged periods. Unlike fear related to a single specific event, which psychologists describe as easier to process emotionally because it eventually ends and allows for some form of resolution, the cyclical, recurring fear associated with the Comanche Moon created what contemporary researchers would identify as a pattern of chronic anticipatory anxiety, renewed repeatedly with each lunar cycle during the most dangerous months of the year. This specific type of fear, according to psychological analyses applied retrospectively to this historical context, can be particularly exhausting precisely because it never allows for complete resolution or a genuine sense of lasting security, as each period of relative relief during lunar phases, less favorable to attacks, was inevitably followed by a new wave of increasing anxiety as the next full moon approached. Personal diaries, p. reserves of women who lived on isolated Texas frontier farms, according to historians who have examined these records with specific attention to documented emotional patterns, often mention what they describe as a perceptible physical sensation of increasing anxiety as the moon approached its full phase, even before any concrete sign of a specific threat manifested itself through any direct evidence of Comanche movement in the region. This pattern of conditioned emotional response, developed through repeated experience and through shared knowledge about the actual statistical pattern of previous attacks, represents, according to researchers in historical behavioral psychology, a powerful example of how a genuine and scientifically documentable external threat can eventually create an automatic and almost reflexive emotional response, even independently of any concrete and immediate evidence of specific danger at any particular moment. The question of how exactly local religious communities incorporated this specific fear into their practices and regular liturgy deserves further exploration, as it reveals fascinating aspects about the intersection between conventional religious faith and practical adaptation to a specific and historically documentable military threat. Local pastors and religious leaders, according to records preserved in some border church archives, occasionally incorporated specific and direct references to protection during the full moon period within their regular sermons during the summer months, openly acknowledging before their congregations the practical and historically proven reality of this specific seasonal threat. Some religious historians who study this particular intersection between theological practice and concrete historical circumstance point out that this willingness of religious leaders to directly incorporate references to a specific military threat within a more conventional liturgical context represents a remarkable pragmatic adaptation, where the practical and urgent need for genuine community protection outweighed, to some extent, more traditional conventions about appropriate content for sermons and for formal prayers within that specific Protestant religious context that predominated among Texan settlers of that period. There are also preserved accounts of more informal and more personal practices where individual families developed specific rituals of their own, combining conventional prayer with more pragmatic practices, such as careful checking of lunar phases through available calendars, creating what researchers describe as a hybrid system of spiritual protection and practical preparation that reflected a genuine attempt to mobilize all available resources, both spiritual and material, against a threat they knew to be real but could not control or completely eliminate through any single means available to them. The true meaning behind this particular combination of religious faith and practical astronomical knowledge is that it reveals how communities under extreme pressure develop sophisticated adaptive systems that combine different forms of knowledge and practice, refusing to rely exclusively on any single approach, even when these different approaches, religious and practical, might appear, at first glance, to be conceptually distinct or even potentially contradictory to each other. There is also a specific dimension related to how this collective fear manifested itself in concrete behavioral practices that border communities developed to try to mitigate risk during these specific periods of greater perceived vulnerability. Researchers studying settlement patterns and community behavior on the Texas frontier document evidence that some communities developed informal mutual warning systems where neighbors communicated specifically about the approach of a full moon during summer months, creating a communication network that allowed coordinated preparation even among geographically distant farms. These warning systems, according to detailed historical analyses, often involve specific signals agreed in advance between neighbors, perhaps firing a warning shot, or a specific visual method such as positioning a flashlight in a visible location that allowed rapid communication about a perceived threat without the need for direct verbal communication that could itself create additional risk if intercepted by hostile forces monitoring communications between settlements. Some historians who reconstruct these specific behavioral patterns point out that this need to develop such sophisticated systems of communication and community cooperation, specifically in response to cyclical and predictable threats, as the Comanche Moon represented, illustrates how communities under extreme pressure develop capacity for adaptive social organization that goes far beyond what formal structures of government or official military protection could adequately provide in that specific context of an isolated frontier chronically underprotected by formal American military authorities. This informal community self-organization, based on shared knowledge about specific patterns of threat and voluntary mutual cooperation between neighbors, represents, according to researchers of the social history of the American frontier, a powerful example of community resilience developed organically in response to a vacuum of adequate institutional protection, revealing a remarkable human capacity for creative adaptation, even under circumstances of severe and persistent threat. There is also a specific question related to how this collective fear affected broader economic and agricultural decisions made by frontier families, creating an additional and less obvious dimension of impact that the threat of the Comanche Moon posed to the daily lives of these communities. Researchers studying the agricultural history of the Texas frontier point out that some families deliberately adjusted schedules for certain more visible or noisier agricultural activities, specifically avoiding carrying them out during periods identified as having greater risk related to the full moon, even when this meant potentially costly adjustments in terms of ideal agricultural efficiency or optimal use of favorable weather conditions for certain specific tasks. This willingness to sacrifice economic efficiency in favor of perceived security, according to economic history analyses applied to this specific context, reveals the extent to which the threat from the Comanche Moon had become a genuinely central factor in the very organization of these families' daily and economic lives, transcending simple occasional concerns to become a structural element that influenced practical decisions in multiple dimensions of daily existence on the frontier, Some historians also document evidence that certain community social activities, including larger religious gatherings or social events that would normally bring together multiple families in specific locations, were occasionally rescheduled or modified specifically to avoid coinciding with full moon periods during higher risk months, suggesting that even the community's broader social and religious life, in addition to individual purely economic decisions, was genuinely shaped and constrained by this specific cyclical threat that this investigation is examining. This deep penetration of the specific fear of the Comanche moon into virtually every dimension of everyday frontier life, religious, economic, social, and psychological, suggests, according to researchers trying to understand the full scale of this historical phenomenon, that we are dealing not simply with occasional fear or peripheral concern, but with a fundamental structuring force that effectively organized and effectively limited possibilities for normal everyday life, for entire communities, living under this specific and recurring shadow of predictable but genuinely inevitable military threat. There is also an additional dimension related to how children growing up in these border communities during the period of greatest intensity of the Comanche conflict internalized and processed this specific fear transmitted by their own parents and the entire adult community around them. Childhood history researchers point out that children raised within this specific context of cyclical and ritualized fear likely developed, from a very young age, an intense and lasting emotional association between specific lunar phases and a visceral sense of danger, creating what contemporary psychologists would describe as early emotional conditioning that could persist well beyond the specific historical period in which real threat remained genuinely present. Some accounts, preserved through later memoirs of people who had grown up on the Texas frontier during this period, collected decades later through historical interviews or through memoirs written in old age, mentioned specific and vivid recollections of how the approach of a full moon during summer was accompanied by perceptible and widespread change in the behavior of adults around them, even when these specific children may not fully understand, at a very young age, the exact reason behind this consistent and clearly recognizable behavioral transformation. This intergenerational transmission of specific fear, documented through preserved memories of those who lived this experience directly during childhood, suggests that L's psychological impact, this Comanche extended far beyond adults directly responsible for family safety and security decisions, also affecting the emotional and psychological development of children who grew up immersed in this specific environment of cyclical and ritualized anxiety, creating a psychological legacy that likely influenced in ways that historians have only recently begun to investigate more carefully. An entire generation of Texans who would later grow up carrying specific formative memories related to this particular fear during the most vulnerable and formative years of their own individual psychological development. There is also a specific question related to how different religious denominations present on the Texas border approached this specific threat theologically, revealing interesting variations in how different Christian traditions processed and gave spiritual meaning to danger as concrete and as scientifically predictable as specific lunar phases. Researchers who study comparative religious history of the American frontier point out that Baptist and Methodist communities, which represented predominant denominations among Texan settlers of that period, developed slightly different approaches on how to theologically understand the relationship between a predictable, natural phenomenon and the genuine military danger represented by a possible Comanche attack. Some theological currents that were more Calvinist in their orientation, according to religious historical analyses, emphasized an interpretation that saw a specific lunar pattern as part of a broader and more mysterious divine order, where even apparently natural and predictable danger remained, ultimately subject to divine will and providence that could, through genuine and fervent prayer, still intervene to protect specific believers regardless of any apparently unfavorable statistical or military pattern. Other more pragmatic and less rigidly doctrinal currents, by contrast, seemed more comfortable with directly integrating practical knowledge about Comanche attack patterns within the broader theological framework, seeing knowledge about when exactly to pray with special urgency not as a contradiction of genuine faith, but as a practical and sensible expression of that same faith applied to concrete and historically verifiable circumstances that the community faced directly. This implicit theological debate, rarely articulated systematically and explicitly in the available records, but clearly present in the differences in approach between different congregations and different specific religious leaders, reveals, according to contemporary religious historians, a broader and more universal tension between religious faith and empirical practical knowledge, that religious communities around the world across different historical contexts often need to navigate when faced with concrete and scientifically predictable threats that appear, at first glance, to operate according to natural logic independent of any intervention or any broader divine will. there is also a specific dimension related to how this collective ritualized fear eventually began to diminish and transform, as direct conflict between the United States and Comanches gradually approached its historic conclusion throughout the final decades of the 19th century. Researchers studying the psychological and cultural transition of communities emerging from a prolonged period of chronic threat point out that the process of unlearning this specific ritualized fear did not happen quickly or completely, even after military decline and the eventual neutralization of the Comanche ability to conduct significant military operations in the region, already examined in detail through previous investigations in the series on the final collapse of Comancheria. Preserved diaries and correspondence of families who continued to live in the same region of the Texas border through this significant historical transition occasionally mention, according to historians who examine these documents, persistence of anxiety related to specific lunar phases, even years after any real and concrete military threat had genuinely significantly diminished, suggesting a psychological pattern that contemporary researchers would recognize as an example of emotional conditioning that persists, at least partially, even after the disappearance of the original and specific stimulus that had originally justified and originated this conditioned emotional response. Some historians suggest that this pattern of psychological persistence, even after practical resolution of the concrete military threat, offers interesting and historically relevant parallels with more contemporary patterns identified in psychological research on how communities process and eventually, albeit gradually and incompletely, they overcome prolonged collective trauma related to chronic and cyclical threat like that which the Comanche Moon had represented so consistently and so deeply integrated into everyday border life through decades of sustained conflict. This slowness in complete psychological overcoming, even after broader military and political resolution of the underlying conflict, illustrates, according to historical and cultural psychology researchers, how deeply ingrained fear ritualized through everyday religious and behavioral practice can take on a life of its own that transcends, at least temporarily, even significant changes in the objective and material circumstances that had originally fully justified this specific emotional response. The question of how the specific story about collective prayers related to the Comanche Moon is preserved and is understood within contemporary historical memory of Texas also deserves careful consideration, revealing how different later generations processed and narrated this particular and lesser-known aspect of the broader frontier story. Researchers working in contemporary Texan oral history document that, although specific battles and dramatic military confrontations between settlers and Comanches remain more widely known and more frequently chronicled within Texan popular culture and within formal historical education, the more intimate and more everyday dimension represented by the specific religious and ritualized fear related to the Comanche Moon remains significantly less documented and less widely recognized within more conventional and more widely disseminated historical narratives. Some contemporary historians who seek to recover and who seek to share more widely this specific and lesser-known aspect of the Texas frontier experience point out that it offers a particularly intimate and particularly revealing window into the true emotional and psychological texture of everyday life under chronic threat, complementing and significantly enriching broader historical understanding that tends to focus primarily on dramatic military events and more prominent historical figures, rather than on the more intimate and more universal, subjective experience of ordinary families, navigating genuine and persistent fear through limited but genuinely creative and genuinely adaptive resources of religious faith combined with practical knowledge and informal community cooperation. Regional historical museums in West Texas, according to researchers documenting broader contemporary historic preservation efforts, have, in more recent decades, begun to incorporate more explicitly and in more detail elements related specifically to this religious and psychological dimension of fear of the Comanche Moon within their permanent exhibits, recognizing significant historical and educational value in sharing this more intimate and more emotionally revealing dimension of the frontier experience, with contemporary visitors seeking fuller and more humanly connected understanding of the specific and genuinely complex historical period. This first part of the investigation examined, through multiple layers of carefully developed historical, religious, and psychological analysis, how specific fear related to the Comanche Moon penetrated deeply into virtually every dimension of everyday life in Texas frontier communities, transforming itself into a ritualized religious practice, a system of adaptive community behavior, and a psychological legacy that would extend through generations and that would persist, at least partially, even after the broader historical resolution of the underlying military conflict that had originally justified such an intense and profound emotional response. Ingrained. The second part of this investigation will continue to explore additional and even more disturbing dimensions of this specific phenomenon, including documented cases where this religious and ritualized fear directly intersected with concrete historical episodes of attack and survival, revealing how theory and practice, faith and brutal military reality converged in ways that continue, according to contemporary historians, to generate debate and deep reflection on the broader nature of how human communities process and survive chronic and seemingly inevitable existential threat. Before we go any further, it is worth examining in more detail one specific aspect that material history researchers find revealing: the specific physical objects and artifacts that frontier families developed or acquired specifically in connection with this practice of spiritual protection related to the Comanche moon. Some historians who study material culture of the Texas frontier document evidence of specific objects, small pocket Bibles particularly worn on specific pages related to protective psalms, or religious medals that families kept close during periods of heightened vigilance, that suggest material and tangible practice complementing the purely verbal and ritualized practice of prayer already examined previously in this investigation. Regional museums that preserve artifacts from the Texas frontier occasionally display specific items cataloged as having a documented historical connection to families who used them specifically during periods identified as being at greatest risk, related to summer lunar phases, offering concrete material evidence that complements and reinforces already discussed textual evidence about the intensity and specificity of this broader religious and protective practice. Researchers examining these specific artifacts point out that the visible physical wear and tear on certain preserved religious objects, concentrated specifically on pages or in sections, related to themes of divine protection and deliverance from danger, suggests repeated and intense use precisely during periods of heightened anxiety, offering additional material confirmation that religious practice related to the Comanche moon was not merely abstract or occasional, but represented repeated, genuinely intense physical engagement with objects, and with specific religious texts invoked repeatedly during times of heightened fear and of perceived need for more immediate and more tangible spiritual protection. There is also a specific dimension related to how women, specifically, developed and maintained many of these religious and protective practices within the border family context, reflecting broader patterns about the division of spiritual and domestic responsibilities within the conventional Protestant family structure of that specific historical period. Gender history researchers studying this particular context point out that women often bore primary responsibility for maintaining everyday religious practices within the home, including specific prayers related to family protection, while men, while certainly also participating in broader religious faith, often assumed more direct responsibility for practical and material aspects of physical defense, including maintaining weapons and organizing night watch during periods of greater perceived risk. This division of responsibilities, although certainly not absolute or universal across all documented frontier families, suggests, according to these researchers, a broader pattern where family protection during a period of threat from the Comanche moon was understood as a genuinely collaborative and multidimensional effort, combining female spiritual protection with more direct male physical protection, reflecting the broader division of domestic labor that characterized conventional Protestant family structure of the time, but adapted specifically to the particular circumstances and needs represented by concrete and chronically recurring military threat. Preserved diaries of specific women who lived this experience directly, already mentioned previously in this investigation, often reveal, according to historians who examine them with specific attention to this gender dimension, conscious and deliberate articulation of this specific spiritual responsibility that these women felt they carried, explicitly describing their personal understanding that fervent and consistent prayer represented a genuine and necessary contribution to collective family protection, comparable in importance within their own understanding of the world to any physical or practical measure that other family members could simultaneously implement. There is also a specific question regarding how this fear and this specific religious practice connected with broader theological debates about divine providence and free will that were circulating within more general American Protestant religious discourse during this specific historical period. Researchers of theological history point out that the tension between belief in divine protection guaranteed through genuine faith and simultaneous recognition of the practical need for vigilance and concrete material preparation reflected a broader and more persistent theological debate within the American Protestant tradition about the exact relationship between divine providence and practical human responsibility, a debate that significantly transcended the specific context of the Texas frontier, but that found in this particular context concrete and particularly vivid expression due to the immediate and genuinely existential nature of the specific threat that these communities directly faced. Some preserved sermons of frontier pastors, according to religious historians who examined them, They explicitly articulated a theological position that sought to harmonize these apparent tensions, arguing that God often worked through practical means and through responsible human action, rather than through direct miraculous intervention that would render irrelevant any practical preparation or any concrete material vigilance, thus suggesting that both fervent prayer and careful practical preparation represented, simultaneously and without genuine theological contradiction, legitimate and complementary expressions of authentic faith in the face of real and historically documentable threat. This specific theological synthesis, articulated and refined specifically in response to concrete and urgent circumstances of the Texas frontier, represents, according to researchers of American religious history, a genuine and historically significant theological contribution that emerged organically from real practical and existential need, illustrating how specific and genuinely challenging historical circumstances can stimulate creative and adaptive theological development that directly addresses philosophical and spiritual tensions that broader and more abstract religious tradition cannot always adequately resolve through purely theoretical reflection, disconnected from concrete and immediate existential circumstance. There are documented cases, preserved through survivor accounts and through military correspondence, examined by historians studying this specific period, where the intersection between religious practice of protection and the concrete military reality of attack manifested itself in a particularly vivid way, and was particularly revealing about how these two systems, faith and practical survival, genuinely intertwined in the everyday experience of frontier families. Preserved accounts from survivors of specific attacks occurring during periods of full moon often mention, according to historians who have examined these testimonies with attention to religious and emotional details, a specific moment where families recognized through direct observation of the night sky that the protection they had prayed for had not materialized in the specific way they had so fervently hoped and desired. This moment of recognition, the realization that clouds had not appeared, that the moon remained full and bright exactly as they feared, represented, according to psychological and religious analyses of these reports, a moment of genuine and immediate spiritual crisis, where the family needed to simultaneously confront imminent physical threat and deep spiritual questioning about the effectiveness and meaning of their own fervent and genuinely sincere religious practice. Some religious historians who examine these specific moments of crisis point out that the documented reaction of many of these families, even in the face of this apparent failure of expected divine protection, often did not involve an abandonment of religious faith, but rather theological reinterpretation that emphasized that divine protection could manifest itself through other means, perhaps through strength and courage granted to face direct threat, or through successful survival, despite seemingly unfavorable circumstances, rather than through the specific and more direct means they had originally requested through prayer for clouds or darkness, protective. This capacity for flexible theological reinterpretation in the face of apparent failure of a specific prayer represents, according to religious psychology researchers, an important adaptive mechanism that allowed the maintenance of faith and hope even in the face of apparently contradictory evidence, illustrating how religious belief systems often demonstrate significant interpretative flexibility that allows the preservation of spiritual meaning even when specific and directly expected results do not materialize exactly in the way originally anticipated and desired. There is one specific account, preserved through family correspondence and examined by historians who study this period, that illustrates in particular detail this complex intersection between religious faith and practical military survival during a specific attack that took place under a summer full moon on an isolated central Texas farm. According to this preserved correspondence, written by a survivor a few weeks after the event described, the family had conducted specific prayer on that particular night, recognizing through direct observation that the moon was full and that the sky remained entirely clear without any cloud cover that might offer additional protection through darkness. The letter describes, according to the historical analysis of this specific document, a moment of collective prayer led by the reunited family, followed by a period of that of tense and silent surveillance, with family members strategically positioned to observe different directions from their relatively isolated housing structure. The attack that followed, described in limited but significant detail in this preserved correspondence, resulted, according to the account, in a direct but relatively brief confrontation, where the family managed, through a combination of prior practical preparation and what the author of the letter himself explicitly describes as force that we felt coming from a place higher than ourselves, resist and eventually repel an attempted invasion of their property. This specific account, according to historians who analyze it within the broader context of other similar preserved documents, illustrates a narrative pattern that appears repeatedly in surviving correspondence from this period. explicit recognition that expected divine protection did not manifest itself through the specific means originally requested through prayer, but subsequent interpretation that strength and capacity demonstrated during direct confrontation itself represented an alternative and equally valid form of divine response to the fervent supplication they had originally offered. There is also a specific dimension related to how these moments of crisis and survival, when shared later within broader religious communities, were processed collectively and incorporated within a broader community narrative about faith and divine providence. Researchers studying shared religious testimonies in border church contexts point out that survivors of specific attacks often shared their experiences directly with their congregations, creating what religious historians describe as a growing corpus of deliverance testimonies that circulated orally and were occasionally recorded in writing, contributing to the construction of a broader community religious narrative about divine protection manifested through specific, historically documentable circumstances. These shared testimonies, according to analyses of community religious history, served an important psychological and spiritual function, allowing the broader community to collectively process individual experiences of trauma and survival, transforming potentially isolating and individually terrifying experiences into shared narratives of community faith that reinforced social cohesion and that offered a shared interpretative framework for making sense of threatening and survival experiences that might otherwise remain processed only individually and potentially in a more isolated and psychologically taxing way. Some historians suggest that this practice of shared witnessing, while certainly serving a genuine religious and spiritual function within the faith context of those specific communities, also served a broader, more secular psychological function, essentially representing a primitive but genuinely effective form of what contemporary psychologists would recognize as communal processing of collective trauma, where structured sharing of traumatic experiences within a supportive social context of shared meaning helped to mitigate, at least partially, the lasting psychological impact that individual experiences of near death and extreme terror might otherwise pose for survivors processing these experiences of more isolated way. There's also a specific issue regarding how cases where genuinely prayed for protection did not materialize at all, cases where attacks resulted in tragic and irreversible losses, including death of family members, despite fervent and genuine prayer previously offered, and were processed theologically and emotionally by survivors and broader communities. Researchers examining these more tragic and theologically challenging cases, preserved through church records and through mourning correspondence, point out that these events represented a considerably more severe spiritual and emotional challenge than cases of successful survival already discussed, requiring significantly more complex and more painful theological processing of the fundamental question of theodicy, how to reconcile faith in a benevolent, providential God with direct experience of suffering and loss with seemingly no clear or easily reconcilable spiritual meaning. Some preserved records of frontier pastors who needed to offer pastoral comfort to bereaved families after specific losses related to attacks during the Comanche Moon period reveal. According to religious historians who examined these correspondences and pastoral records, theological approaches varied and often genuinely complex, including an emphasis on divine mystery that transcends limited human understanding, on eschatological hope related to future reunion in the afterlife, and on explicit recognition that earthly suffering, although genuinely painful and genuinely difficult to fully comprehend within a limited human theological framework, did not necessarily invalidate broader faith or continued divine presence even in the midst of seemingly inexplicable tragedy. This ability of borderline religious communities to process and to integrate even the most tragic and theologically challenging experiences within a framework of continued faith, rather than complete abandonment of religious practice in the face of apparent failure of prayed for protection, illustrates, according to researchers in historical religious psychology, remarkable spiritual resilience that allowed maintenance of structure of meaning and supportive community even in the face of more devastating and genuinely difficult circumstances to reconcile with simpler theological expectations about divine protection guaranteed through sufficiently fervent and sincere prayer. The broader question that this comprehensive investigation seeks to explore, by examining both cases of apparently successful survival and more tragic cases of loss despite fervent prayer, is what this broader pattern reveals about the fundamental nature of how human beings, across different historical and cultural contexts, develop and maintain systems of meaning and faith in the face of genuine and scientifically predictable existential threat. Contemporary researchers in religious psychology and cultural history who examine this specific phenomenon of the Comanche Moon as a broader case study suggest that it illustrates in a particularly vivid and particularly well-documented way how human communities generally do not simply abandon religious faith in the face of apparently contradictory evidence, or in the face of a statistical pattern that suggests a clear limitation on the effectiveness of specifically and directly requested divine protection. Instead, according to this broader analysis, religious communities demonstrate a remarkable and historically consistent capacity to develop more flexible and nuanced theological interpretations that can accommodate both the success and apparent failure of specific prayer within a broader and more resilient framework of meaning, allowing for the maintenance of faith and continued religious practice even in the face of circumstances that, viewed through a purely logical and external empirical lens, would clearly appear to challenge or even invalidate simpler theological assumptions about the direct and guaranteed relationship between fervent prayer and corresponding divine protection. This adaptive and resilient capacity of religious faith systems, demonstrated repeatedly through the specific case of the Comanche Moon examined throughout this comprehensive investigation, offers, according to researchers who study comparative religious phenomena across different historical and cultural contexts, a valuable contribution to broader understanding of how religion functions psychologically and socially for human communities, facing genuine existential threat, revealing patterns that likely repeat themselves with specific cultural and historical variations across countless other contexts where human communities need to find ways to maintain hope, meaning, and social cohesion in the face of real recurring danger and only partially controllable through any available combination of religious faith and practical preparation. There is also an additional dimension of this investigation that deserves specific consideration: how this particular story about prayer and ritualized fear connects with a corresponding indigenous perspective, offering a necessary and historically important counterpoint to the narrative focused exclusively on the settler experience that this investigation has examined in greater depth up to this point. Researchers working in collaboration with the contemporary Comanche Nation, already mentioned in previous investigations in this series, point out that while Texan colonists developed an elaborate system of fear and prayer related specifically to the summer full moon, the Comanches themselves, as previously examined, maintained a completely different and fundamentally more positive relationship with this same astronomical phenomenon, seeing it as a strategic ally and even as a spiritually significant element within their own broader belief system. This fundamental asymmetry, where the same specific celestial object represented absolute terror for one people and strategic opportunity and even positive spiritual significance for another, illustrates, according to contemporary researchers seeking greater historical understanding, as balanced and more multifaceted as human experience of any specific natural phenomenon is genuinely shaped and genuinely determined by completely different cultural context, historical position, and material circumstance, even when different human groups observe exactly the same objective and scientifically identical astronomical phenomenon. Recognizing this broader asymmetry, these researchers argue, in no way diminishes the authenticity or genuine meaning of the fear and specific religious practice that Texan settlers developed in response to the real and historically documented threat they faced. But it offers fuller and more honest historical context about how this specific fear emerged directly from broader conflict dynamics where both sides, settlers and Comanches, responded rationally and understandably to the specific and genuinely challenging circumstances that each group faced within the broader historical context of colonial expansion and indigenous resistance that characterized this crucial period of Texan history. As we conclude this thorough investigation into the specific ritualized prayers that Texan settlers developed specifically in response to the cyclical and historically documented threat posed by the Comanche Moon, it is important to reflect on what this particular story, often overlooked by more conventional historical narratives that tend to focus primarily on dramatic military confrontations, reveals about the deeper, more universal human dimension of the broader historical conflict between American colonial expansion and indigenous resistance that this series of investigations has examined through multiple complementary perspectives. The specific experience of frontier families literally praying that the moon would remain hidden represents, perhaps more vividly than any dramatic battle or any more conventionally celebrated heroic historical figure, the true emotional and psychological texture of living under cyclical and partially predictable but genuinely uncontrollable existential threat through any single and completely effective means available. This specific emotional texture, the ritualized fear, the desperate prayer, the coordinated communal vigilance, and the remarkable ability to maintain faith and hope even in the face of variable and sometimes tragic outcomes, offers an intimate and genuinely revealing window into how ordinary people, without any power over the broader military or political forces that shaped historical conflict around them, found ways to survive psychologically and spiritually in the face of circumstances that completely escaped their direct individual control. The final question this thorough investigation leaves for broader reflection is how many other specific religious and cultural practices developed organically by ordinary communities facing specific historical threats across different contexts and different periods around the world, remain similarly neglected within more conventional historical narratives that privilege dramatic events and prominent figures over the more intimate and more universally human everyday experience of fear, of faith, and of the tireless search for meaning and for protection in the face of genuine and persistent danger. Sources and reference works for further study. Archival records of Protestant churches on the Texas border, preserved in regional historical collections, personal correspondence and diaries of frontier families preserved at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, research in comparative religious history on theology of divine providence in contexts of existential threat, historical religious psychology, studies of communal processing of trauma through shared testimony, documentation from West Texas regional museums relating to religious artifacts and materials associated with the 19th century frontier experience, gender historical analyses of division of spiritual and practical responsibilities within Protestant family structures of the American frontier, contemporary documentation from the Comanche Nation relating to indigenous perspectives on the cultural and spiritual significance of specific lunar phenomena.